Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Employers Institute in partnership with AIHR. So from this fabulous collaboration, we are expecting very, very interesting discussions today. But before I introduce all the speakers that you'll be seeing, let me just get some things out of the way, technicalities here. We are offering AI-generated translation for caption as well as audio. So if you are interested, you'll see the instructions on your screen in a little bit. But if the link is in the chat, and if you go to the right side of the web page and toggle, you will see the different options. We are offering translation from English to Mandarin, Portuguese, French, Spanish, Italian, as well as German. So please feel free to go ahead and select your language of choice. And you should be able to either see the captions in translation or listen to the audio translated version of it. So having said that, let me bring forth some fabulous speakers that we have on our panel today. Really, really excited to welcome Dr. Dieter Felsman, as well as Dr. Marna van der Merwe from AIHR. Welcome, you guys. But of course, we also have our very own Dr. Emily Cook, our senior HR researcher at Employers Institute. Now you will get to say hello. Oh, there you are. I think there was a slight lag where I couldn't see your faces. I freaked out a little bit. But there you guys are. Welcome. Well, just to start off with, of course, we'll get to speak to everybody in a bit. But the topic for today, from protest to purpose, sounds super, super simple, but it does have a wide array of topics sitting very nicely within it. And what we'd like to talk about today is to simplify things a bit for HR when it comes to ESG and sustainability in general, right? So how do you make it super practical? What steps to take right now, right here, and in the long term? But also, if you're passionate about the topic, which is obviously the case if you're attending this webinar, is going beyond that simple reporting. How do you actually start to create that impact as HR, as employers, right? And last but not least is going a little bit into that concept or idea of employee activism. Super relevant, very, very interesting, and what role can leaders play in the whole scheme of things? Now, here's a story I always love to share. A few years ago, when we introduced the topic of sustainability within our Top Employers survey, we got quite a bit of backlash from the HR community because the stance was, this is such a business topic. Why are you guys asking us these questions? We have nothing directly to do with it. Well, fast forward to today, what we see is a very different picture. We see more and more top employers have actually integrated the concept of sustainability, its principles, and also working on ESG. It's central to the decision making and becoming more and more important. With the rise of the awareness around the topic, it's very clear and it's very obvious that the business returns that you get when you dive into the topic, the financial value of it, and also the sole idea that your candidates, your employees are also looking into it has completely blown it into a proportion that is much suitable for the topic under discussion. Now, I'll stop for a little bit for now, because I'd like to invite Dr. Dieter here, because he is a great moderator, and we'd love to have his expertise to make this session a lot more interesting. So, Dieter, all yours for now.
Thank you very much, Amara, and good day to everybody. It's really fantastic to be here. And I want to kickstart by saying I really love your story. And I think it sums up so well the transitions that we've seen within the ESG space and HR specifically. And I remember a couple of years ago, we always had that conversation on, but why is this important and why we should be talking about it? And I think that has really shifted to what we want to cover during the course of this particular webinar is but how do you go about doing this in a practical sense? Whenever I engage with a lot of HR professionals, they say, we know it's important, we want to contribute, but how do I practically do it? And what is my responsibility and role going to be? So I'm going to kickstart and really guide us through the three topics that Amara has presented to us. I also have the rare privilege of being able to play devil's advocate with three lovely panelists and seeing how can we really cut through a lot of the noise in the ESG space and make sure that we leave you with something practical to implement as well. So Marna, I'm going to put you on the hot seat first to ask this question. When we talk about ESG and bringing it to life in HR, you've recently completed some work looking at what leading companies are doing in the ESG space. What can we learn from that? And would you mind sharing some of your insights in terms of how these companies are approaching and thinking differently about ESG?
Yeah, I think thank you for the opportunity. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and the research that I'll share wasn't necessarily initially focused on ESG, but we looked at HR or people strategies broadly. We looked at 50 top performing companies, so they were either financial performers or they were great places to work, so listed on the Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 lists. And we started looking at what is publicly available and what do they talk about in their people strategy. So the busy slide that you are seeing is just one of the research outputs where we started looking at, in their strategic focus areas, what is commonalities that we see across different industries and what are the things that are different. And no surprises there, the type of industry really dictated where the focus would be. But what we saw that was interesting is that there were three things that came out consistently across these top performing companies and the things that they make very visible and focus areas, and that was ESG, which is our topic for today, DEIB, and then employee engagement. We then took a step further and we looked at how do they actually then speak about it and what is different or the same, and we saw it in how they operationalize it or in the very specific activities or commitments that they make. There are very distinct differences. Those differences were related to the workforce composition, so who the actual employee base is, dictated a lot of what practically transpired. The industry, obviously again a big impact on how people talk about ESG and what they make visible, and in the core of their strategy or their overarching purpose was then another impacting factor. And we saw a continuum of how people think about ESG and how it plays out in the organization. Some organizations to the left follow very much an inside-out approach, so they focus predominantly on their own workforce and internally through initiatives like, for example, employee development and upskilling. That's how ESG transpires for them. On the other end, we see a much more externally focused approach where organizations start looking beyond just the organization, so they start considering the communities that they are in, kind of the broader environmental impact in some of the industries. So we saw this dichotomy in how it plays out, which I think is really interesting. I think what we found quite profound in the research as well is, regardless of how it plays out in practice, it is this alignment between what is done in the ESG space and then how that relates to the organizational purpose, and the closer that is, the more authentic it is. But yeah, that's in a nutshell what we found, what top performing companies do in the ESG space. Yeah,
thanks, Mara. What I really love about what you talk about is for me three things there around the fact that I think they have a very clear definition of what does ESG mean for them, and I think that was one of the key things, listening to you, that I really pick up, that there's this notion around, we don't just take it in generalistic terms. We say, what does that mean for us, and where are we going to focus, and where are we going to make a difference? I think it's quite important to take away the decision that you make strategically about the inside out or outside in focus, because I think that dictates a lot of the activities. And I think often for employees, this disconnect between who we say we are versus what we do internally or what we do within the communities. And I think that's really important. And then, I think the link that you make towards this very strong notion of purpose. And on that note, Emily, I want to come to you, and I'm going to play devil's advocate on this one a little bit more, because a lot of times we talk about purpose, and I think purpose is a very big word that means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And very often in this context, from an organizational point of view, we almost fall into the trap of, can I call it ESG washing, diversity washing, greenwashing? So what have you learned really in terms of purpose and how that plays out in organizations?
Absolutely, it's a big challenge. So given the scrutiny around, as you say, diversity washing and similarly sustainability washing, it is essential to look beyond the statements about what top employers are really doing to make ESG meaningful for employees. At Top Employers Institute, we work with around 2,300 organizations, and that means we have a lot of insights about what really moves the needle. So the slide you're looking at here, we see some data that gives us a very clear view on specific practices driving measurable outcomes. In this table, we see that certain practices are directly linked to important metrics. For example, practices like consistently incorporating social and environmental impact into decisions, embedding purpose into HR practices, and empowering voices are highlighted here in this slide. So how to read this? Where there's a black dot, it means that that practice is actively driving one or more key outcomes, whether that's financial value, business growth, or stronger employee engagement. Because we work with such a large number of organizations and we have access to such a rich data set, we can be very confident that the relationships we see here are very consistent and very reliable. This data tells us that top employers aren't just adopting ESG for optics. They are embedding these practices strategically across the operations, which in turn drives financial performance. It boosts engagement, it supports long-term growth for individuals, and for the organizations. The key takeaway here is that they are taking a targeted approach, using specific actions to make ESG real, impactful, and benefit for both people and business outcomes.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Emily. And I think what stands out for me, I love when you mention they go beyond the statements, right? And they go in terms of tangible, focused activities. And I think what is quite insightful also is from your data is the relationships that we start to see. Because I find a lot of organizations even veer a little bit too much to the internal side of things, and it's only about the story we tell, the engagement we create, whilst others sometimes veer almost too far to the outside of things to link it to what Marna has mentioned from inside and outside focus areas, where it's all about the others in the community and the differences that we make and the environmental impact that we have. I love the fact that we are able to link them together because I think it changes the narrative and the conversation quite a bit in terms of how we position this to business stakeholders, how we start having these conversations, and I think make them tangible and practical. And Amara, I want to build on the practicality. At heart, I'm a practical individual that says it's great that we talk about it, but what does that look like in practice? And how can we learn from some of these leading organizations and the things that they put in place to make sure that this starts being ingrained into their DNA? Because I think something I'm taking out of what both Marna and Emily is mentioning is it's not something that sits outside of how you do business. It has to become a lot more integrated and ingrained in your decision-making, your processes, your key considerations there as well. So any insights you can share from work that you've done with clients around how they make this practical for
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me say I completely agree with that whole link with what is important for the business, what message you're putting out there. And I think here HR's role mainly becomes how are you taking all of that and embedding it, like what you were saying, Dieter, into your work environment, into your policies, into your people practices. So I'd like to sort of divide what I'm going to say into 3 bits, because I think it's important. Like, one is that long-term view. So if you step out of our HR world for a few seconds, let's look at the ESG scores, for instance. That's something that main stakeholders right now, your investors, your consumers, they're really looking at what are your scores? Why are they doing that? It's because it gives them an indication you're a business that's sustainable or that is also going to be sustainable in the future 5 to 10 years from now. So from an employer perspective, if we look at it with the growing interest into ESG, with growing awareness, with the reporting standards and general sort of changing expectations, who's to say that we cannot use something like that to also dictate and showcase what kind of employer we are? A sustainable employer in the long term. So it's not something I'm talking about right now happening overnight. But let's take an example. I've had some very interesting conversations around limiting risk to your employees' job security. That is one thing that can sit under being a sustainable employer, right? So how do you do that? That doesn't mean that if you're opting for that direction, you're never going to have to lay people off. That doesn't mean you're never going to have to let somebody go because business directions change. Things happen. But then in this whole scheme of things, what do you do to actually equip your employees with the skills, with the up-to-date skills that the minute they have to leave your organizations, they're picked up right immediately in the market. That's what being a sustainable employer means. And we've seen plenty of examples of such initiatives, such strategies among top employers, like Takeda, for example. There is one company that has gone through major transformations every now and then. And they've done little things like, okay, we're going to keep employees at the heart of business decision making here. So let's look at how can we use internal mobility to move these people around instead of simply letting them go. And even then, if we have to let them go, let's put a professional support team on it so we can help them actually find something outside. That's where your societal impact comes into play, right, in the long term. But in the short term as well, what we see more and more is top employers incorporating and embedding these sustainability principles into the employee journey. For instance, if you're really looking at a sustainable future as a business, why not recruiting for people who actually share that vision? Look at Unilever. You see that everywhere on their career website, everything that they do. Sort of cascading it down into performance conversations, into your performance evaluation. How are you contributing to the overall social purpose of the company? That's another example. I'll relate that further down to something like well-being, which really impacts employee experience. But hey, is it part of your performance conversations? Because what that does is it tells your employees that you care about them. It empowers your middle management in embedding well-being into the work itself. We have seen an amazing number of top employers growing year after year who are really, really taking on that practice. And the last bit for me is that awareness bit. It's our employees, our candidates are on different journeys when it comes to the awareness about the topic, and you have to meet them where they are. We've seen examples where you're starting from scratch. So we have, for example, this is not starting from scratch, but HCL Tech has launched the sustainability school where they want to make sure their employees are bought into everything that the company has put on the agenda from a business perspective and ESG, right? So the sustainability school talks about things like green coding, green marketing. It talks about ESG in general, sustainability in general. Then we have another top employer in Italy who have launched Sustainability Olympics. Let's challenge people. How are you going to incorporate all these little things into your everyday life? So those are like bits and pieces of different ways companies are making this happen, and that's really beautiful to see.
I think that's fantastic insight. And for me, what stands out really is this first idea. I think you are spot on by saying that people still need some education to be able to make the connections to the activities that we do and how it contributes towards the bigger ESG agenda. When I speak to a lot of HR professionals, they often comment to say that either they did not know that some of the activities that they were doing falls underneath some of these pillars, or on the other side, the translation does not happen when we have to tell employees why certain things are important for us and why other things are not important, and some decisions that we need to make.
Yeah.
I also love about, is definitely this idea just that it's not only, about binding yourself to a particular good news story narrative, it's actually about committing to a principle. Because I think that's very different. And I think that's where a lot of employers sometimes get stuck or are hesitant to speak out about their real contributions or to speak out about what they really stand for as part of these things for fear of what's going to happen down the line. And I think it's a beautiful thing to think about. But, there's also a reality that we need to take into account as we start shifting and changing. And your view around balancing short-term with long-term, I think that is so powerful because organizations work on different time horizons, and we need to acknowledge that this is a longer-term time horizon, but it is about the actions and the commitments we make today to be able to get there. So I think it's a fantastic way to phrase it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Deidre. I just wanted to add, because what you were saying just triggered another thought. I think from HR perspective, it's very, very quickly you start to make it like a checklist exercise, right? So you have to remember that ESG metrics are not something that's so solidified, quantitative. It is also qualitative because it has to fit your context. You're not just gonna look at your absenteeism rate for the sake of absenteeism rate, but implementing a practice of including well-being into your performance conversations really feeds into that overarching metric as well. And I think we get lost in the technicalities of it quite a bit.
No, definitely. And I mean, I think maybe to shift us to the next part of this conversation, really, when we start talking about how we make this tangible, practical, I think some great insights from the three of you on be clear on your focus, be clear on what it means for you, ingrain and embed it into your core business, go beyond the statements and connect the dots for people around these varied stakeholders' views around what is important for them and how we look at them at different time horizons. I want to move us forward a bit, just really to start thinking about, because for a lot of people, they will say it's great that we talk about these things. These are things that we are already doing, but to be very honest, it's a reporting exercise. I hear that quite a bit. On the one side, they say it's a marketing exercise around how we position and how we show up. And on the other side, they say it's all about reporting. You mentioned very often investors getting increasingly interested in what some of these metrics and numbers look like. Now, all of you mentioned purpose as part of making it practical and making it real. And Emily, I want to throw the question to you around when we start thinking about how do we go beyond the reporting side of things. I think there's some interesting insights you've unearthed, especially when we start thinking about younger generations and their connection to purpose and connection to the organization. Do you mind sharing with us?
Thank you. That's correct. So I think that some organizations are not prepared for the incredible changes Gen Z are going to expect from us. By next year, they will make up 27% of our workforce, and they have got some very strong views on purpose, work, and social stance. Earlier this year, Top Employers Institute surveyed 1,700 Gen Z individuals. We got a really great global sample. So we looked at 8 different countries, and their message was very clear. They want a genuine connection between personal values and professional lives. 81% said senior leaders should take their input seriously, regardless of how long they themselves have been in the organization. They don't just want a job, they want to be respected and involved in shaping the organization's direction. We think about community. 78% want connection and a sense of belonging at work. They are very much redefining our workplaces as a space for meaningful impact beyond traditional roles. Thinking now about career purpose. 77% expect, if they put in enough effort, to have meaningful careers. It's not just about pay or titles. It's really about making that impact, aligning with their personal values. Something that was very surprising for me is this 66%. That's a huge number who said that they would turn down a job or even an assignment if it didn't align with their beliefs. This is a very, very clear message they're sending to us. Their ethical boundaries are going to hold strong, whether that's talking about accepting a job or performing work once they have that job. Then looking at this, taking a stand on social issues, more than half expect their employers to support causes that they care about. So for Gen Z, neutrality is not an option. They want to see their employers committed to making a positive social impact.
No, I love that. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, I'll just conclude here to say that Gen Z really are raising the bar. They're already here in our workplaces, and they are the ones that are going to be shaping the future of work. So this topic is just going to continue to accelerate in importance.
And I think you're spot on, right? I think we already, and I think a lot of people can also comment about that in terms of seeing Gen Zs entering, and then the dynamics that is now in the workforce and workplace with multi-generational workforce composition. And I think it is then also about what matters to different people and values and how they express themselves. And I mean, we've seen some significant, I think, examples over the last couple of weeks, also with US elections kind of running rampant at the moment. We've seen quite a few examples also about, but what do organizations do with this new dynamic and focusing on that a little bit more. But before we deep dive into the activism part of this and the stance that people want, I want to bring it down one level, because a lot of this also relates very strongly towards the element of trust and the employee experience and how that dynamic is also starting to change. Emily, you summarized it beautifully to say, no, loyalty is no longer a thing that is really core to the employment contract. It's much more about fit and alignment, and I'll say no if I feel that I'm not in a place that aligns and gives me meaningful work. Marna, I know one of your other loves is employee experience. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about how is this going to influence practices like employee experience, employee value propositions, this changing dynamic between employees and employers?
Yeah, I think I was nodding, Emily, as you were going through it, because words like meaning, belief, those things we suddenly associate with work, which is very different if we think even 10, 20 years. I don't want to give away my age, but in the very recent years, those have become much more important. So I think to distill it into three big shifts, the first one that we see is that work plays a very different role in our broader lives. So it's much more integrated, and so we experience things like meaning, satisfaction through work. So it's not just about the jobs that we do. And then, of course, by implication, we have a different set of expectations around employers and how they enable that for us. So suddenly it's not just around, do you pay me a competitive salary, but what are your values, the beliefs, the purpose of the organization, and to the 66%, does it align with what I want of an employer? And that is suddenly a very big consideration for people. And then the last one, I think, is around just the external environment. And I think a lot of employers shy away from even acknowledging the existence of all of these tensions in the world. But we face a lot of societal issues, economic issues, environmental issues, and employees bring that context to work. It's not like they step into the organization and they leave that behind. And employers who don't have a voice or an opinion or even just acknowledging that are experienced kind of tone deaf or insensitive or even just devoid of reality. So I think in a nutshell, I think those are the big three things that are shifting. So it is around making clear to employees what they can expect of us as an employer. And something like the EPP is a very good place to talk about what do we fundamentally believe as an organization, what are the very tangible things that we are focusing on, so our ESG objectives as an example. And then I think, Amara, you mentioned a lot of the translation around what do employees actually experience through our practices and processes that shape the employee experience, which is essentially how we then deliver on all of those promises that we make. So I think EVP really useful in just clarifying expectations so that when we attract talent to the organization, they can opt in. Like, is this an environment that they resonate with? Does it align to their belief system? No surprises down the line. And I think to retain talent, it's also very useful in just outlining how people are contributing beyond just their job. So what are the things that they are making an impact on? Because we know that is what work is now much more about than just a 9 to 5 that I do and I switch off once I get home. So I think in a nutshell, I think those are probably the biggest things that we've seen and how it impacts things like the EVP, the employee experience as well.
And I also think this notion around choice and autonomy, I think, is also coming through quite strongly. And I really love the fact that you talk about managing expectations, because I think that's going to be one of the biggest things that leaders and managers will have to get right, regardless of the generational complexity, but also around what we can and what we can't do as an organization. I know there was some research that was released recently that also spoke about the fact that employees still have a lot more respect for you as an employer if you come out with a stance, even though it might be contradictory to their personal view, but at least you took a stance and you had the conversation with them as well. And Amara, I want to build on that particular point, because a lot of this sounds like culture change, and a lot of this sounds like businesses having to think very differently about identity, culture, values. What are you seeing in the market to kind of start pulling together this idea of a new work relationship?
Well, absolutely. That whole idea of employee experience, I think it's very much synced with employee listening, right? Like we kind of, as employers, you don't have choice anymore. You have to listen to your employees or you're just going to get left behind in so many different ways. And we've definitely observed that shift among top employers as well, and rightly so. Those that have adopted integrated strategies when it comes to employee listening are definitely the ones that have higher engagement. There's also, if we talk about the business side of things, and when we look at the revenue and revenue growth, profitability, it's absolutely linked to involving your employees in that change, right? So there's no sort of debate about this at all. And there are like some real simple is maybe not the right word, but like a couple of examples that I'd like to put out there, which I found super interesting because they were so impactful. So recently, JTI, one of our global top employers, they redid their set of behaviors. big thing, big aspect of culture of the organization. But they didn't just make it something that your executive committee is hashing out and then cascading down. They did it through design thinking, and they took their employees along on that journey. And it ended up with about 1,000 employees being involved in that iterative process. So going through the focus groups, to surveys, to like going back and forth, and even testing out what was created. Let's test it out. Let's make those tiny changes and really make it like agile enough to eventually come to something that was a fine balance between what the business was looking for, but also what the employees were looking for. And I think that's beautiful because it gives the employees that ownership. Like because if you're part of that change, you are going to want to adopt it because it's yours. You kind of feel your heart is in it. So I think that was one of the great examples that I recently had the chance to talk about. But there is another one that comes from Puma. And it had to do with their employee resource groups. Again, very much focused on how do we change the culture of the organization. And what I really like about Puma's ERGs is not that it's, those committees or those groups exist and do follow their mandate or whatever, but they are also really, really focused on the learning, the career, the leadership development of their employees as well, especially the underrepresented groups at Puma. But what I love is the story behind it. How did this whole change start? All it took was in 2020 in the US, we know a lot of things happened that changed the course of history in some ways. There was also the pandemic, of course, that changed the world forever. All it took was 8 employees from minority groups that basically went to the senior leadership of Puma and said, guys, we need to be listened to more. We need stronger voices within the company. And that gave rise to this initiative, which they called Reform the Workplace. Mm-hmm. And what that resulted in was structuring these ERG groups that are aimed at providing safe space for these groups and also enabling them to go for that career move that they felt like maybe had imposter syndrome for or whatever, but helping them in developing leadership qualities and all that great stuff. And all in all, it led to like the whole company moving in the direction of creating inclusive culture. And I think that is just gorgeous, right? Because it's the employees really initiating that change for the company. I think that's those were 2 of my favorite examples, if I can put it that way.
The idea of co-creation, right? And I think that's such an important one, and being listened to and also feeling heard, I think is becoming quite a central theme whenever we talk about ESG, whenever we talk about culture, whenever we talk about employee engagement and employee experience. And I think we've started to see, unfortunately, that a lot of organizations that don't pay attention to that, or where listening is a very fragmented type of experience, they don't see the benefits and the values. And very often employees need channels and avenues then to also express their discontent, because somebody once told me, when people complain about things, it's not a bad thing. It means they're investing energy to want to make things a lot better in future. And I want to move that across in terms of this idea around employee activism. And Emily, I'm going to come to you on this one. Very often employee activism, and even the word sometimes, is perceived in a very unhealthy way, right? As HR professionals, very often we get the instructions to say, go and walk the floor, make sure that conversation doesn't go any further as part of that, where we are actually promoting the idea of co-creation, dialogue a lot more, etc. So can you help us understand employee activism and voice? Is it a bad thing? And if not, who's doing it well in terms of really making sure that their employees feel heard?
I was on mute. Thank you. That is indeed a great question. That word activism is it's a little bit scary, it's true. And balancing healthy and unhealthy activism, as you say, is a challenge. It's a challenge that we're all facing. I love this example from Reckitt. They really work to structure that activism in order to drive engagement and purpose. So how did they do this? Well, they created a purpose council, which was an internal committee where employee volunteers from across all the departments championed one of 3 pillars: So they chose DEI, sustainability, and employee experience. This setup channeled the employees' passion in a constructive way, meaning they were able to align that activism, that energy, that passion with the company's mission, rather than creating tension between the two. Our data also shows that organizations with these structured listening strategies and active employee networks report higher engagement and stronger performance. So when companies provide these formal channels, just as Reckitt did, for employees to voice their perspectives, they foster positive, purpose-driven culture, rather than the tension and that activism that we can sometimes be concerned about. This approach of structuring, welcoming in the voices and the passion benefits the employees, and it also benefits the organizations. I love this example because it illustrates perfectly how to structure that activism in a very practical way while supporting organizational goals. I really hope going forward more organizations will follow this approach that Reckitt have chosen.
I think it's a great example to share around how do you utilize this in a constructive way. And, I also think you start driving a very different conversation internally in the organization around when we listen, you are heard. And when you are heard, you're also part of the solution. But that also comes with mutual ownership and accountability. Because I think that's such an important thing we need to get right whenever we start talking about purpose, because purpose is also shared in terms of what we need to do. I want to start wrapping up for us just in terms of a couple of things, and then Amara, I'm going to hand over to you because I think we've got a couple of really great questions in the Q&A to also get to. But at the beginning, we said we wanted to just touch on 3 different themes, and firstly around how we bring ESG to life. I think we spoke very much there about it has to be focused, you have to define what it means for you, and you have to go beyond the statements. And I think that's such a key thing to remember whenever you sit around a table with a variety of stakeholders starting to discuss what are we going to do in the ESG space. We spoke about how to shift beyond only reporting, understanding who your employees are and what their needs are. And we utilize Gen Z there as an example to say, listen to this need for autonomy, choice, and take a stance on what this is going to mean for the employees that you want to bring along this particular journey. And then I think Emily summarized it beautifully for us around employee listening, employee voice, employee activism. These are positive things within the organization, but they need to be guided in an intentional way so that we can really capitalize with regards to that as well. For me, to the panel, thank you very much. I think it was some significant insights that we've tried to cram in a very short period of time, really with the goal of making ESG and sustainability more practical for HR professionals and giving us a starting point to really contribute as well as we move into the future. Amara, I'm going to shift over to you as well, just to help us through some of the Q&A and some of the questions that we see. What is it that you've got for us?
Great. Thank you so much, Dieter. And as expected, fab moderation of this. So thank you for that. And thank you, Marna and Emily, for insightful discussions here. But truly, we do have some great questions. One of them being, let me see if I can display this. Yeah, for the time being, I see a lot of multinationals leading the process. What would you advise for SMEs? What are the key leadership skills that should be leveraged? Dieter, any thoughts on this from you first?
I think great question. And Lisa, I think context matters, right? So I think if you're an SME, go and look in your particular context, what is going to be important for you to focus on, what is practical and a reality that you can actually tackle, because I think that's quite an important component, and do that translation. I would not necessarily go too broad. I would then rather go a lot more specific and do 1 or 2 things really, really well in that particular space. And from a leadership point of view there, I think it is important, that translation component that we've spoken about. But start with basic education for people to understand where this fits, identify for your organization what you want to focus on and why it's important. And then I think do the equipment and enablement of your workforce as well.
Lovely. It's a great answer. I also wanted to just quickly add in terms of like leadership skills. I think we refer to activism towards the end. There was this research done by Megan Rice and her team, which basically said activism is in the eyes of the beholder. I love that statement because it's really like, how do you look at it? Do you look at it as troublemaking? Or are you looking at it as something that is an opportunity to learn? And I think for smaller organizations as well, if you're able to inculcate that message right from the get-go, I think that would be like a great start to that journey. Another question we've got here is, I'm just trying to see, we've got 2 votes for this question, so I'm going to go for this first. It's about Gen Z. Gen Z would appear to have a different mindset from older generations. What are organizations doing to address changing mindsets or closing the gap between the generational mindsets? Any real practical examples that you could share? Emily, do you want to speak to it first before I go to maybe Marna?
Yes, absolutely. So I love this question. And indeed, this level of intergenerational conflict we haven't seen before. So it's one of my favorite topics. So we do have some great examples in the longer research report. But the key takeaway I would give is that where we've seen success is where HR professionals haven't tried to pander or adjust around Generation Z, but really embed these practices that we know are good for all generations. One of my favorite examples, very briefly, is Puma India. They have 47% Gen Z compared to the 27% norm. They are doing very, very exciting work. One thing they are doing is actively providing working time and space for employees to pursue their passions with whatever variety they are. So whether they are purpose in one direction or perhaps a different political stance or a different social priority, they just provide the space and encouragement to all employees. They have seen huge increases in their employee engagement.
Lovely. Great thoughts, Emily. Marna, do you have anything else to add?
I think that's a great example. We just looked at our HR trends for next year, and one of the shocking discoveries for me personally was how much of the workforce will be much older generation. So we also see that that's kind of the fastest growing population in the workforce. So I think the focus on sameness instead of differences. So we see a lot of organizations just focus on breaking down some of the preconceived ideas and stigma, specifically around like old people in the workplace, and things like reverse mentoring programs is a nice way to just focus on where are we similar instead of just focusing on differences, and everyone has such different expectations and perceptions. So I think the older generation is also a very interesting consideration with this multi-generational workforce.
Absolutely, you're very right. Like I often wonder, like if every organization should just basically chart out their employee journey and sort of see the experiences, kind of, where do they fit when it comes to the different personas, right? Isn't that like the way to start thinking about it, at least?
Yeah.
Easier said than done, I agree, but I think that's the way forward, because the expectations over the last few years have changed so much that you kind of have no way around it, basically.
Yeah. If I may add to that, Amara, I think there's also this idea around the fact that understand who your workforce is as human beings and what their real needs are, and then focus on what those are, as opposed to, I think, misconceptions and preconceived ideas that we sometimes find and people start to adapt to. In alignment with what both Emily and Marna's mentioned, what I find really interesting at the moment is that, may I call them, just for lack of a better term, the gimmicky EVP experiences, where some of the younger generations are actually moving away from that and saying, give us the things that really matter. Go back to basics: fair pay, decent work, meaningful engagement, environment where we can flourish, opportunities to develop. So I think it is about going slightly deeper in terms of what's the real need for the human being that you're trying to solve in their context and in where they are in their career journey.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Thanks, Dieter. It's getting me all pumped up because they're all making such good points. But let's see what other questions we've got. There's another interesting one here. With remote work increasing, cybersecurity risks, should HR what specific policies should HR put in place to safeguard data while maintaining ESG standards and employee well-being and flexibility? Dieter, anything that you guys have come across here specifically?
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer it from the back end maybe first. I think something that you shouldn't be doing, where a lot of organizations fell into the trap, is where they have these conversations around surveillance, productivity, and how do I know whether my people are working or not, which points towards this big gap pertaining to the trust relationship that just breaks down. So I think that's a very dark hole to go down that I don't think is a positive direction for you as an organization. I think on the other side, there's a couple of things that businesses do well and that we've started to see. First, they need to understand their footprint much better and the impact of their footprint now when they start thinking about newer tools and flexibility tools, etc., and what that's going to mean and look like. So I think understanding that new type of reality. When we talk about well-being, the right to disconnect is quite a big conversation at the moment. In some countries, it's being legislated, but it is more about this conversation pertaining to, do we have fair boundaries in place and reasonable expectations, especially when people start working in more flexible ways, and the 8 to 5, 5-day-a-week work week is not necessarily the norm for anybody else. Very silly little example, and I'll wrap up with that, is where people write you emails. I don't know if you've seen a lot of companies do that now, to say, I recognize that my work hours is not your work hours, so I do not expect to reply to this. Reply at your convenience when you are back at work. Now, it's something so simple, and a lot of people will say, but it's just a statement, nobody looks at it. But it is expressing this idea that I see you and I recognize your well-being, and your needs and requirements are different than mine. And I think that's what good companies are doing. It's not about legislating and securing everything in policy. I would rather drive that a lot more through culture and ways of work, and what we value and what we tolerate in the business. And I think that's what I've seen in practice.
I love that. And personally, I can share an example where a few years ago, actually, our COO, he started putting that in his email signature because it's just how he worked. He preferred to work on a Sunday and get rid of his emails. But usually I'd get like 10 emails from him in one go, but it gave me the impression that I did not have to respond to him right away. And it was, okay, I'll respond to him on Monday. He's not expecting an answer. It's just that. Mm-hmm. Especially as leaders, I think you can really create an impact with those little things. Vacation embargo policy is also one that we've included in our survey. And it's like, when people are on holidays, leave them alone. Mm-hmm. Let them have their holiday. So thanks, Dieter. There's another question here where this person has been a longtime AIHR member and also an HRD, currently pursuing MBA in leadership and sustainability. Woo, you've got a nice combo there. And would like to know if you're aware of a framework for HR that would be similar to triple bottom line.
I can jump in on that one. So lovely to have you with us. Firstly, thank you for joining our collaboration webinar. There's a couple of frameworks that you can look at. What is important, though, is that you look at some standardized measurement frameworks around how we start thinking about that. I think triple bottom line is very good, but you need to cascade that down a bit more into the practicalities, of what that would look like. And then I think go and have a look as well. There's also on our side, we actually do discuss the different frameworks that you can think about from an HR point of view. And there's 2 or 3 out there, but I would say start with an internationally recognized framework, then bring it down a level to localize it in terms of what you want to do and what you want to look at there.
Thanks, Dieter. I hope that answers the question. It was a very interesting question. I'd like to dig into that myself. But in the interest of time, I think there's a need to wrap up, even though I wouldn't like to, but unfortunately, we're all bound by time somehow. But thank you so much, Dieter, Marna, and Emily, for joining this. It's been such an interesting discussion. I wish we had 2 hours, but we didn't. And thank you to all the audience for listening to us, for your interesting questions. We hope you enjoyed it just as much as we did. Do look out for an email from us with the recording, as well as a short, very 2-minute long survey. We'd love to hear how you liked it or did not like it, and how we can improve these sessions for the future. So once again, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.